I sometimes read books that I'm not always comfortable talking about on YouTube or on social media because of their content or their subject matter or some of the themes. And I'm sure I'm not the only one like this. You know, they contain stuff that's maybe a little taboo. And it kind of made me wonder why. Why do I read these kinds of books? And why do other people read these kinds of books? Why are we drawn to this kind of like taboo literature or forbidden stories? So yeah, I asked myself this question, why do we do this? And why would I think that they're important to read? So in this video, I'm not going to review books, but I'm going to talk about why we read what I think of as taboo topics in literature. So before I go any further, I guess I should kind of apologize or explain a little bit. I'm on holiday, so you can see I'm in a hotel room, and I've got a little bit of a throat thing because the pollution here in Bangkok is really bad today. I'll share a quick shot of what that looks like. So sometimes this stuff gets stuck in your throat. So anyways, let's go on talking about taboo topics in literature. So we can start with the definition of taboo. I think we can all agree a taboo would be a topic or a behavior or a belief that society thinks should be forbidden or is wrong. And that isn't always decided by the collective society. Sometimes it's decided by a small group of people in society. It could be a subculture within the larger culture that decides it has its own taboos. Or it could be kind of a ruling body, it could be the government, it could be a religious body that sort of dictates what those are. And those are usually coming from social norms, cultural norms, it could be political. Could also be religious in some cases. And in some cases too, these are kind of, if you break these taboos or you engage with these taboos, you know, you could, the consequences could include ostracization, being ostracized, there we go, being ostracized, sort of pushed into the margins of society. There could even be legal consequences, especially in a country like America. So a good example would be in America, reproductive rights have always been a taboo topic. People don't like to talk about that. People always get very uncomfortable about it. And also the government likes to get involved in it. So there's, you know, legislative action that can dictate what the larger acceptance of that is. So if we think about taboo topics in literature, so this would be writing, fiction or nonfiction, that in some way explores or discusses the taboos of the society that it's coming from. Or it could also be describing in another society or what the writer has experienced in another place. So again, these are things that are considered culturally forbidden, and it could be a bit broader now too. It could even, I think we can broaden this out to topics, things we don't like to talk about, which could include politics or political ideology, definitely religious ideology, definitely certain types of behaviors, even something, I don't want to say it's common, but something as long-standing as drug addiction. This is still kind of a taboo topic, or drug use that people are uncomfortable talking about. But you know, literature is a good way to explore that. And also with literature too, we can broaden it out into maybe talking about different forms of oppression or systemic racism and things like that. So those would be what I consider kind of what taboo literature would be. And I'm sorry, one more thing with that. The purpose of taboo literature should be to get the reader to start thinking and to have a sort of thought-provoking experience for the reader surrounding that taboo. So some examples of taboo literature. So I've got kind of some classic examples. The big one that is everyone thinks about when you think about taboo books, taboo literature, would be Lolita by Vladimir Nabakov. This was published in 1955. If you're not familiar with this book, I'm a little surprised. If you're watching BookTube videos, you should probably know at least about this book. If you don't, it discusses, or it's about a very inappropriate relationship between a grown man and a young girl. And if that's not bad enough, what I think makes the book actually really taboo or really controversial or difficult is that the narrator, who is the man, Hubert, he is very morally ambiguous about what he's doing and the way he lives his life and the choices that he makes, particularly with regard to his relationship with this girl. So there's that. Another example would be Ulysses by James Joyce. This was published in, sorry, I have to look at some notes, 1922. Not necessarily as controversial as Lolita, however, it was banned in the US and in Britain for quite a long time after it was first written. I don't know, I can't remember when it's been published. It's been printed and banned and published, and it has a very sort of contentious kind of history. What made it controversial, or continues to make it controversial, again, the subject matter, there's a lot of descriptions of bodily functions in it. I'm laughing because if you've read it, at least in my opinion, some of it was a little humorous and very kind of adolescent. And I think it tried to sort of break the norm of not talking about these kinds of things. But also too, a lot of the sexual thoughts and desires of the characters are pretty explicitly described. And of course, there's a lot of profanity that goes along with that too. Another thing that made this novel made this novel controversial, and is still controversial about it, is the stream of consciousness style of writing, particularly when James Joyce is discussing the interior monologues of the characters. It's a stream of consciousness style. And when it was published, a lot of people asked the question, is that actually writing? Is that actual literature? Is that like polished prose? I think people still ask that question when they read it, because it can make it very difficult to read. Another example, the last example I'll use, Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger, published in 1951, so before Lolita. This is frequently banned in schools and public libraries, which always surprises me and always kind of shocks me. I read it, I think we read this in 9th grade, in the first year of high school, so I'm surprised that this still gets banned. It's criticized for profanity, some sexual content, although, I mean, compared to what you can see almost everywhere today, it's pretty tame. But I think also what makes it still a little controversial are some of the themes of angst, criticizing the hypocrisies in society, and of course a lot of profanity. But again, like profanity, like it's such a widespread thing now in American media. I don't know how anyone can get upset about that anymore. But I think the big thing about it that makes this book difficult for some people is the questioning of authority, especially amongst teenagers. So some examples of banned literature. So why are we drawn to these? Why are we drawn to these stories? I think the main reason, the most obvious, but probably the most relevant, is just plain curiosity. You know, we're always curious about things that are banned and things that are forbidden. And that's just, you know, human nature. I think it can be a healthy thing. Of course, it can also lead us, you know, down the wrong path. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit too. But just, you know, we're always curious about things that are forbidden. It kind of really fuels our interest in them. We always want to know, why is that banned? Why did that get blocked? Why can't we use that? You know, and it just really like stirs up curiosity about it. I think the book Lolita is a great example of that. It's a very notorious book that a lot of people probably hear about and know about without having read it. And a lot of people who do read it probably read it because of the controversy that they've heard surrounding it. So another good example of this would be American Psycho by Bret, Easton, Ellis. Very notorious book. A very notorious and graphic film was made from the book. And I think that's a great example too of how the reputation or the controversy around a book or a movie that comes from a book can often overshadow what actually is in the book. Because if you read American Psycho, you'll quickly realize that the story is not really about the psychotic killer, that there's a much larger kind of meta-narrative that is the real story of what's going on there. So, but that's a different subject for a different video. But when we read these kinds of books, so we get drawn to them out of curiosity, but what can end up happening is they have an impact on us, and they can have a very emotional impact on us and stir up very strong reactions to the topics that are depicted and explored and discussed in these books. And hopefully part of our reaction to that is not just like repulsion or shock. There will be some of that, but hopefully it is to get us to start to question societal norms or our own norms, our own beliefs, and start to ask ourselves, why does this happen? Why do I feel this way about this? What's really going on here? And that will kind of lead us further into exploring the human condition. And we should ask ourselves these questions, but we should also ask, like, how do these people feel about this? I know that sounds like a very sort of wishy-washy, touchy-feely thing, but we do need to think about, like, for example, if we're reading a book about an alcoholic, we kind of need to ask ourselves, you know, not only do we have our own reaction to that, but we need to think about, like, how did this person get here? What's driving this? Why did they continue to do this? You know, and are there things there that we can recognize and maybe help or apply in other parts of our own lives or in the lives of people that we know? So that kind of leads to a adjacent topic or a similar topic that we do need to ask ourselves with these kinds of books, with taboo books, particularly I think books that depict certain types of behaviors like drug abuse, alcohol abuse, sexuality, violence. We need to ask ourselves, where is the line? Where is that division between discussing something that's taboo in a thought-provoking way and depicting it in an exploitive way, or so it's just exploitation? And what we need to ask ourselves is, how is that topic dealt with and portrayed? Is it dealt with nuance and subtlety? And what is the author's intent? And this is always like a big topic when we read these types of literature, when we look at these types of art. What is the author's intent? What is the artist's intent? Is their intention to create conversation and thought-provoking reflection within the reader or within the viewer? Or is it simply to entertain and excite and maybe shock? So if it's just to entertain, if it's just to shock, that's definitely just exploitation. That's a different thing. But if it's there for discussion and to be thought-provoking, then we can think, okay, they're dealing with a taboo topic, and this is definitely more in the literary realm. So it's difficult to know where that line is, and it's in a different place for everyone, but it definitely exists. We shouldn't think that this line doesn't exist, but we need to be careful about where we draw this line, and we need to understand that to a large extent, the line is in a different place for everyone else, and we need to be respectful of that. A good example of this from my experience is the book Tampa by Alisa Nutting. This is similar to Lolita by Vladimir Nabakov in that it portrays a relationship, a very inappropriate relationship between an adult and an adolescent. So it's the story of a middle school teacher who has a relationship with one of her students. That relationship is very physical and of a very sexual nature, which is completely wrong and completely inappropriate. In my opinion, the book veered very quickly into the exploitation side of that line or that zone and kind of didn't come back. And I didn't really care for the book. I don't discuss it on my videos or anything like that for two reasons. One, I didn't really like it. I don't make videos about books I don't like. And two, I just felt like it's just too, in my opinion, it was just too smutty. It was just almost pornographic. Someone else could think very differently about the book. And a lot of people do think differently about that book. It has been critically acclaimed. You can find lots of videos and blog posts where people talk very highly of the book. So that's a good example of where that line is, just in a different place for different people. And we do need to be respectful of that, but we also just need to be aware that the line does exist somewhere. So some questions to consider when we're thinking about, is this exploitation or is it actual literature? Is the subject handled with care and subtlety and nuance? And does it serve a purpose for the narrative? Does it actually help drive the story, or is it just kind of some fancy dressing that's been put on to pull in readers or to create controversy or to sell books? So that last thing too is like sometimes we need to also think about what is the intention of the publisher. It's not always the intention of the writer, but sometimes the intention of the publisher or the editors. And sometimes they can shape, or the way they shape or market a book or a film can also push it one way or the other. So, all right, so the second question, why? Why is this important? Why are taboo topics in literature important? Why shouldn't we just steer clear of them, right? Especially in this day and age, we have such a hard time discussing these kinds of topics. Maybe we just should avoid them. Well, I think there are two really important reasons, and then I'm going to ask you to maybe share your thoughts on this as well. I think the first reason is that it forces society to face its own hypocrisy. Exploring taboo topics in literature really helps close the gap, or at least draw our attention to the gap between what we say we do and what we actually do. And we can find that these are actually sometimes very far apart, sometimes very, very far apart, sometimes not. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't acknowledge it, we're never going to close that gap. So, and I think writing is a really powerful way to do that, because it can bring in a very personalized experience, and it's also a really lasting record. Books really last much longer than films do, especially nowadays with streaming services and things like that. Books, movies, TV series, documentaries, they can quickly disappear. And if the licensing company doesn't want to bring it back out because they don't think it's going to make money, you're never going to see it again. But books, they're around. It's a physical thing. It's still a physical media. It still exists. So it's always going to be there. So it also helps document personal experiences of people who go through, various types of oppression or various types of experiences. Books about the Holocaust are a great example of that. The civil rights movement, slavery, and, all sorts of different things, all sorts of horrible things in history, but they're important to document. Otherwise, we forget and we repeat. So also too, I think books are can be a more thought-provoking way to help us question our own social responsibility, or kind of give us like a litmus test or a check. Like I said before, are we actually doing what we say we do? Or have we veered off course? Are we going somewhere else? And that connects to the second point that I think is really important, and that is encouraging critical thinking and dialogue. And we seem to be in an era where we have misinterpreted critical thinking to be criticizing rather than actually thinking about what's going on and how could it be done better. Also encouraging dialogue. Again, I think we're kind of in an era of confusing, arguing and screaming and shouting at each other with having a dialogue. So again, books, writing, fiction and nonfiction, whether it's journalism, memoirs, essays, or novels, short stories, plays, things like that. Again, a very powerful way, a very effective way to initiate and to stir up start these kinds of processes, is what I'm trying to say. So those are my thoughts on taboo literature and taboo topics in books. I think it's extremely important. I think, they're not always easy things to read, and they're not supposed to be, but, they are really, really important. So I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on this, and I'd like you to share some comments below. What are some books that you've read that have changed the way you've thought? What are some books that you felt uncomfortable reading at the time, but have kind of stuck with you and have maybe shifted your perspective on certain things? I can give a really great example. I recently read Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr., which is a really difficult read. It's portrays the lives of some really down and out people in Brooklyn, some groups of people that I had never really considered, who have very difficult lives or had very difficult lives. They're obviously not alive anymore because it's set in right after World War II. But it was a book that really kind of changed my perspective on how those people lived. So what are some books that you've read that have shifted your perspective, that have changed your mind? And how do you feel about talking and discussing taboo topics in literature? Please leave some good comments and some constructive comments below.